Welcome to the book club where the size is just right, the books aren't too long, and you never need to host. That's our job. We bring best-selling and award-winning writers of every genre to Twin Cities metro area libraries to share their stories, discuss their work, and answer those burning questions you've always wanted to ask your favorite authors. This is a book club where we don't have to argue about what the author meant. They can tell us. The book club that doesn't require a clean house or wine and cheese. And in this book club, if you haven't read the book, it's all right. Although, we hope you'll be inspired to pick it up next time you're in the library. I'm your host, Slade Kemet, and you can consider the book club rewritten because this is Club Book. Club Book is made possible by Minnesota's Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, MELSA, and Library Strategies, part of the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library. We would also like to thank our partnering bookseller, Red Balloon Bookshop. This podcast features Marjan Kamali at St. Paul Public Library, Hayden Heights. Historical fiction heavyweight Marjan Kamali is a leading figure with the flourishing Iranian-American literary tradition. Her novels spotlight the lives and irrepressible spirit of Iranian women across generations, both in their native country and the global diaspora. Kamali's maiden novel, Together Tea, follows a mismatched mother and daughter pair who emigrate to America, but despite their contrasting natures, each feels drawn back to Iran. Her follow-up, international bestseller The Stationery Shop, is a saga of love and loss set against the backdrop of the 1953 coup d'etat that overthrew Iran's democratic government. Kamali returns to the tumultuous period in her latest book, The Lion Women of Tehran. Inseparable as children, friends Ellie and Homa are pulled apart by political upheaval and personal betrayal. Later in life, a haunted Ellie seeks out her childhood companion to confront and atone for her checkered past. Book Reporter calls The Lion Women of Tehran a beautifully crafted and subtle exploration of love, family, friendship, ambition, betrayal, and redemption in a socio-political powder keg.
All right, thank you all for being here tonight. This is really wonderful to see, and it's my first time in Minnesota. And yes. And you're giving me a very warm welcome, which I deeply appreciate. We are standing room and sitting room only. So I thought that while we gather here tonight, I would share with you a little bit about my own writing journey and about the story behind the story of the Lion Women of Tehran. This book has now been out since July of 2024. The hardcover came out in July. The paperback came out this past July 24. The paperback came out August 25. So I have had the pleasure of meeting readers all across this country, and now I can add Minnesota to the list. What I'll do is I'm going to talk a bit, then I'll do a very short reading because I know that we're not in the most comfortable of positions, and then I'll open it up for Q&A, and then we'll do a book signing, okay? So basically, I grew up moving a lot, and the U.S. is the 7th country in which I've lived. I've lived in 7 countries total, and I've lived in 5 continents. And when you grow up moving so much, you're always trying to find a sense of home. And I was always trying to find a sense of home. I was always failing because I tried to find it in a region, and I never quite found that region, much as I love the Boston area where I live now. But my home became books, and reading really became my homeland, because it's very fitting that we're in a library tonight. Every single place we moved to, one of the first few things my mom would do is she would take us to the local public library. And so libraries became for me a sanctuary. And I could feel my nervous system just calming down the minute I stepped foot into a library. It still holds that magic. It still holds that magic. And back then, I was what you would call a bookworm. And back then, adults would say to bookworms a lot of the same phrases that we now say to kids with their phones. Like they would say, can you just please put that down and be present? Or they would say, you know, you're hunching, it's going to ruin your posture. It's going to ruin your eyesight. And that was our problem today, that the kids were reading too much and we were begging them to put the books down. But I love to read, and my love for reading became solidified during a very pivotal time in my life, which coincided with a very pivotal time in Iran's life. So you see, I've written 3 books, and all 3, because they take place in both Iran and the US, because I write about Iran so much in all 3, people assume that I maybe grew up in Iran. So I only lived in Iran between ages 2 and 5, and then again 9 to 10 and a half. But that second segment was a pivotal time in the country's history because it was right after the revolution of 1979, and it was during the beginning of the Iran-Iraq War. So there was an 8-year war between Iran and Iraq in the 1980s. And I was there for the first year and a half of that war. And we spent many nights in the basement as the bombs fell. And my mom, like most moms, tried to make this experience as palatable as she possibly could. And she had stocked our basement with board games and with books. And I have a very bossy older sister who was adamant that I not forget my English, because remember, we had come back to Iran from overseas, so I already spoke English. And so she encouraged me to read all my mom's books that were in English, and my mom's books in English were all the British classics. Yeah, so like Charles Dickens and the Bronte sisters and Jane Austen. So there I was in the war, I'm reading these British classics in the basement, and my sister would make me write book reports for her that she would then grade with a red pen. And I did it, and I don't know why, looking back now, it's like, why did I do that? But you know, older sisters have a certain power. And so I did it, and every time I made it back upstairs, I was aware of 2 things. How lucky I was to make it back upstairs, and also the power that those authors had. Because just by stringing together words on a page, they were able to transport me to a different time and a different place. And so reading gave me such comfort. And one other thing that gave me comfort during that time was I had a best friend in the 4th grade, and we did everything together. We played together, dreams of who we'd grow up to be. But we also shared our fears because we were young girls living in an increasingly autocratic state, and we were living during a time of war. And so when my family left Iran without my saying goodbye to my best friend, I arrived in New York City at the age of 10, knowing that I needed to live doubly hard for both of us. And for a while we exchanged letters on those aerograms. Some of you remember. But then we lost touch. And I became very determined to be a very good girl and to study hard. I attended eventually a high school in Manhattan that specialized in science and mathematics, which is every writer's dream. But you know, those were the fields that were venerated. And I went off to college. I attended the office hours of my English professor. And he asked me what it was I was doing. And by this time, he'd read some of my stuff. And I told him, yeah, I'm going to major in psychology and I'm going to be a doctor. And he said, well, I think you should change your major and I think you should be a writer. Wow. Yeah. And him saying that it was as though I walked out of that building and the sun was shining brighter and the birds were singing. And he gave me permission to entertain this notion that I'd had my entire life, but to take it seriously. And so I went back to my dorm, and I called home and I broke the news that I was going to major in English. And there was a bit of a sigh at the other end of the line, but I did do it. And I couldn't believe that you could get a degree for reading and writing, which I would have done anyway. But then when I graduated and I went back to the East Coast and I was applying for jobs, everybody kept asking me how fast I could type. And it was very hard for me to get a good job and make a living. I ended up being an administrative assistant in the laboratory of biochemical genetics and metabolism. It led to an entire misunderstanding where this man thought I was a scientist. But anyway, because he did, I ended up marrying him. So that was worth it. That was worth it. But eventually I realized that perhaps I needed to find a new way to, make a good living. And I'd applied to law schools and gotten rejected from every single one. Every single one rejected me because, maybe because in my personal statement I wrote that I wanted to be a novelist. So they were on to me. Good thing they didn't get me. But eventually I did end up in business school. I had worked for a startup magazine, and that experience allowed me to enter business school. So I was sitting in the back of the business school lecture hall, and as luck would have it, of course, on that campus, the business school building I was in was situated so I could look out the window and see the building for the Master of Fine Arts. And I could see that building, and I wanted to be there, but I was here. And so as my professor talked about Excel spreadsheets and how to use them to find the bottom line of a company, I started to daydream, and I thought, well, what if an Iranian middle-aged mother used Excel to create a formula to find her daughter the perfect husband? And those of you who've read Together Tea, my first novel, know that that is a premise in that book. And I wish I could tell you that I wrote those sentences and it became a story, which became a novel, and then it got published, and on we went. Well, between when I wrote those sentences in the back of that lecture hall to when the book got published took 13 years. 13 years. In the meantime, I would occasionally go to the assistant dean. The dean wouldn't see me. I went to the assistant dean and begged to maybe do like a double degree with the Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing, and she would say no one's ever done that before, which I thought wasn't a very good reason. And then I remember going to her office right before the Christmas holidays, and she looked at me and she had on her desk a can that said Ashes of Problem Students. And then, this is a different time. And then finally she said, do whatever you want outside of the school. So I applied outside of the school, and I ended up at NYU at the MFA program, and there began my double life, where for a few years I'd go uptown to business school with all my Republican friends, and then I'd do a little switcheroo and go downtown to NYU with all my artsy-fartsy liberal friends. And everybody said you're crazy, but I did it because I suppose I felt I really had to make the most of every opportunity. I remembered the friend I'd left behind. I remembered all the people I'd left behind. And eventually I finished both programs, and let's just say that I started a family, and then there were years when my life was basically playgrounds and play dates and play groups, and not one sentence of writing, let alone reading. I practically didn't have time to read. And it wasn't until many, many years later, when my youngest went off to kindergarten and I came home, and it felt like a a new beginning, really, because I had more time. And my husband and I discussed what I would do. Would I go back to work? What was I going to do? And I want to be very careful to say it was a position of privilege I was in because I didn't have to work full time. And eventually he said to me, why don't you go back to writing that book? I know. And I said, what book? And he said, the book you've been thinking about every day for the past many, many years. And so I found the floppy disk and we converted the file, and then every day I went to my local public library and I worked on that book. And that book became Together Tea, my first novel. And after it was published, I did all kinds of readings, and at one of them, a woman asked me if I would visit where she worked. She said she worked at an assisted living center in Duxbury, Massachusetts, and I said, sure. So I went down there, and I was doing a reading, and a gentleman in a wheelchair kept calling out. And then they had organized this lovely Persian lunch, because there's a lot of food in all my novels, as some of you may know. And he wheeled himself up to my table, and he said, did you know that I traveled with the Prince of Spain? And did you know that I knew Charles de Gaulle? And everybody kept telling him, leave the author alone. They were a little embarrassed by him, but I did ask him his name. And later, when my dad asked me how the book readings were going, I mentioned this gentleman because he had an Iranian name. And my father, God bless him, he thought he knew every Iranian-American. And so he said, oh, that was one of our most decorated dignitaries. He met the Prince of Spain, and he traveled with Charles de Gaulle, and he did all these things. And it was only then that I thought to Google him. And there it was all there. And I kept thinking, what must it be like to be an elderly person in an assisted living center with the past that nobody believes, or if they believe it, they don't really care? And those of you who've read The Stationery Shop know that my second book opens with an elderly man. He's at the Duxton Senior Center, which is my clever disguise for Duxbury. And then in walks the woman he had been engaged 60 years ago. So I didn't make it about this gentleman's diplomatic past, but The Stationery Shop is a love story. And it's about two teenagers who meet when they're 17, and they fall briskly, as F. Scott Fitzgerald says, into an intimacy from which they never recover. And they're all set to get married, but on the day that they're supposed to get their certificate, the country erupts into a coup d'etat. They're separated, and Roya looks for Bahman, can't find him. Eventually she moves on to a life in America, marries Walter, until 60 years later, she finds Bahman at the Duxton Senior Center. So there's a lot of crying in that book. There's a lot of crying, and whenever I'm in a book signing event and somebody comes up to me with tears in their eyes, I just look at them and I say, Stationery Shop? And they go, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So after The Stationery Shop came out, I started writing the next book, and it was about 4 moms in suburbia who were really obsessed with where their firstborns would get into college. Yeah, I had to really use my imagination for that one. I live in a very competitive town in New England, and let's just say that in my version, as I was writing these women, it was slowly becoming a murder mystery. Because the moms were that neurotic about it, And then the pandemic began, and we were in lockdown. We were in what they called 2 weeks to slow the spread. And so it was a time of great uncertainty. I wasn't quite sure. None of us knew what would happen. And I started to scroll mercilessly on Instagram, and I came across these posts from my friend. My friend from Iran. And I was flooded with so much emotion just seeing her again. And so many years had passed. I mean, here I was, an author telling stories in America, and there she is working at a human rights organization in Iran. And I kept thinking how these friendships we make when we're young, they really shape us. And their influence on our lives lasts, even if the friendship itself doesn't. And I think friendship breakups are just as heart-wrenching as romantic ones, though we don't have as many songs for them. Though my daughter tells me Taylor Swift has one. So we're good. But I knew in my heart I really wanted to write the story of a broken friendship. And so I took a deep breath and I put away those moms. I started to write the Lion Women of Tehran. 2 girls named Ellie and Homa. They meet when they're 7. They come from very different stations in life, but they form a fast bond. And we see them go through the joys of childhood, girlhood. We see them go through the ups and downs of adolescence. They go off to university together until an inadvertent betrayal ruptures their friendship. And then decades later, this is not really a spoiler, they reconnect in America. So I made Ellie and Homa born in 1943. That way I could cover the arc of so many decades and sort of so many expansions of rights for women, and then you know, the retraction of those rights. And as I was more than halfway done with this book, a real woman in Iran, Mahsa Jina Amini, was arrested. And well, her death in police custody caused these protests where women and girls especially, but men too, poured into the streets. It started a whole movement, the Women Life Freedom movement. And I watched it from afar. I wasn't there, but I knew I had to honor these women, really. And you know, one of my professors at that NYU program was E.L. Doctorow. And yeah, I know, what an experience that was. And he is known for saying that history books show us what happened, but fiction shows us how what happened made people feel. And that's really what I'm interested in. And so I made up Ellie and I made up Homa, but they're very real to me. And I hope through them to show you the courage and complexity, really, and vibrancy of these 2 girls from Iran. And so now, if I may, I'm just going to do a very short reading. I know we're not all in a chaise lounge, so I'm going to just read the first page, really, the first page and a little bit, starting at the very beginning. As Julie Andrews tells us to do, it's a good place to start. Okay. And you don't need any context because it's the beginning. Chapter 1, December 1981. I stood on the lacquered floor, a small woman in black with a rectangular name badge on my chest. My coiffed, contented look was calculated so I'd appear not just satisfied, but quietly superior. In America, I'd learned the secret to being a successful salesperson was to act like one of the elite, as if spritzing perfume on customers' blue-veined wrists were doing them a favor. A sea of haughty New Yorkers swerved to avoid my spray. Thank God for the more down-to-earth women, the cooks and bakers coming up to the first floor from the basement home goods section. They were too polite to reject the fragrant droplets I offered. Orange, lily, jasmine, and rose notes nestled in the lines of my palms and the fibers of my clothes. Look at you, Ellie. Soon you'll take over this whole brand. I better watch my back. My friend and co-worker, Angela, returning from her cigarette break, sidled up and whispered in my ear. The scent of her Hubba Bubba gum couldn't hide the smoke on her breath. I shivered at the reek of tobacco. The bitter, sour notes would forever remind me of one long ago night in Iran. The night when an act of betrayal changed the entire course of my friendship with Homa and both of our lives. From the moment I'd read Homa's letter last night, I'd been a wreck. I batted away Angela's compliments, said I wasn't doing all that well really, and that I had a headache because I hadn't eaten all day. I just might faint, I added with a touch of melodrama. It was a relief when Angela was whisked away by a needy customer. My mother always said, the envy of others invites the evil eye to cast doom on us. She'd often told me that being perceived as too competent, happy, or successful could summon misfortune. I knew belief in the powers of other people's jealousy and the jinxing of an evil eye needed to be cast off. But at the age of 38, in the middle of that massive Manhattan department store, I was still unwittingly beholden to superstition. The truth of who I was could not be escaped, nor could the flaw I had spent years trying to quash and erase. The guilty one had always been me.
With that, we have reached the part of our podcast where we turn to our club book audience for questions and comments for Marjan Kamali and her work. In this book club, we like to encourage members and authors to connect and engage and help bridge the gap between the page you read and the process it took to write it. Our first question of the night comes from an audience member wondering if Marjan Kamali is more like Ellie or Homa.
I was asked that question. It was at a reading in San Francisco, and I answered that I was more like Ellie. Because Ellie, for those of you who don't know the two characters, Ellie has more insecurities. She certainly has a fatal flaw, a terrible quality, which is she's a very jealous person. And she just has much more self-doubt, whereas Homa is one of those rare people who walks amongst us, who's just naturally confident, comfortable in her skin. She knows who she is. She becomes self-actualized at a very young age. She has a strong moral core. After I answered that, my daughter pulled me aside and said, "You're Homa." And then I was like, oh, wow. That was a good moment for me. But I think the truth is that I'm a little bit of both. And I think most women are a little bit of both. We have a little bit of Ellie in us and a little bit of Homa. It's like we're a little bit country, we're a little bit rock and roll. Yeah, there are days when I can channel Homa and I feel like I can almost feel her energy coursing through my veins. And then there are other days when I'm definitely Ellie. But Ellie does change and evolve to become more comfortable with who she is, and she has a reckoning, so that's also helpful for her character arc. But yeah.
This audience member asks, what keeps Kamali motivated to write?
Well, I spent many years not writing, and those were mostly my 20s, which is sad because my brain was probably really good then. Lost a lot of good time, but that's okay. Here's what I learned. I used to think that you needed ribbons of uninterrupted time in order to focus and to write. And I never had that because I was either working or I had small children or both. And so years went by and I didn't write. It wasn't until I learned that you don't need to go away on a retreat. You don't need to have a week to yourself. You don't need to have a day to yourself. Who has that? If you will forgive me, 45-minute chunks of time. And I learned this method, which is you basically set your clock for 45 minutes. During those 45 minutes, you do nothing else. No internet, That's the devil. We don't do that. And you just focus on your work, on your art, and then after 45 minutes, get up, do something else. So that really helped me finish the first book. I'm giving you, this is a nuts and bolts exercise, but I think you're asking for a more overarching philosophical mantra or, reminder that keeps you going. Well, we all have that one reader in our minds who means the world to us, right? All of you mean the world to me, all of you. But if I were to just think who is the one person on this planet that I owe something to, that I want to write for, it would be for my daughter, because I owe her of the culture she doesn't know. I owe her the role modeling of use what God gave you. I owe her that. And if you don't have kids, it doesn't have to be a child of yours. It can be somebody else's, right? And I think it helps to have that North Star. It could be a friend you knew. It could be a relative. It could be an ancestor that you feel you owe something to. Why do I keep saying you owe something? Because a lot of times for women, we don't do something unless we think we're being of service to someone else. Because if I said, oh, I'm going to write because I really love it and it's fun, there'd be a part of my brain that's, oh, that's too indulgent. Go scour the skink, don't go do something else. So I'm just saying when you think of something like that, then it's a bit helpful.
This question is about what language Marjan Kamali writes in.
I write in English, but when they're speaking, and they're speaking Farsi in the book, they're speaking Farsi in my brain. And so I translate it as I'm writing. I hear the dialogue in Persian, and there's certain phrases and words that are just so perfect that don't necessarily have an English equivalent. So I do sprinkle some of them in, but I always give the context. It's never like you're missing something. A reader wrote to me and said, I wish I knew what the words in italics meant. And I said, well, I say what they mean right after I write it. That's what it means. But then I realized, how would she know? She doesn't know. So yeah, I think of it in Persian, yeah.
Our next question is, what scenes are the hardest for Kamali to write?
So in the Lion Women of Tehran, the hardest chapter to write was the Cinema Rex chapter. And those of you who've read the book can imagine why. I did not want to write it. In fact, in my first draft, it was 2 paragraphs. And I just sort of alluded to it. And no spoilers, okay, well, okay. But it's a difficult chapter. And then my editor came back to me and said, you might want to elongate this and draw it out. How could I possibly write this? But then, as you know, I used a little distancing trick where Homa imagines what it must have been like, as opposed to us being in Abdul's point of view.
This Club Book audience member wonders about translating the gender challenges in Iran relative to the United States.
It's always interesting because when you write fiction, what you're really trying to do is tell the truth. And so it was very layered because on the one hand, I'm writing about a country where oftentimes the women from that country are portrayed as being very oppressed and submissive and, maligned. And some of that is very true. And yet, Lion women, I knew them. I've grown up with them. They're in my family, they're in the country. So this kind of strong, opinionated, audacious woman is also the Iranian woman. And so I felt like I couldn't just cater to the stereotypes that people expected. So I was very much aware of that. And I was very much aware of, real people I know. And trying to do justice to the complexities of those women, but always top of mind, always.
Our last question of the night comes from an audience member wondering about the relationship between Ellie and Homa.
it's really easy to know why Ellie is friends with Homa. She's very aspirational. Why is Homa friends with this sort of insecure child? I think the answer is twofold. One, maybe if they hadn't met when they were 7, they wouldn't have been such good friends. Maybe it's the fact that they met as children, and children are very agnostic. It's like, you want to play hopscotch? You know, I don't care if your father's a communist or not. So some of that is because of the shared history and the bond they established when they were so young and so innocent. But the second part of that question, the second layer, is that it's Homa. She does not judge Ellie. She sees Ellie for who she is, but unlike Ellie's mother, she sees the best in Ellie, and she sees her potential, and she sees what she could be as opposed to all the things she isn't. And that's because of Homa's generosity of spirit, you know? So I think that's the second reason. All right, thank you.
That wraps up our St. Paul Public Library event with Marjan Kamali. Make sure to catch our last podcast of the season with Oinken Breitswitz. Nigerian-British novelist Oinken Breitswitz burst onto the literary scene in 2018 with her propulsive and singular debut thriller, My Sister, the Serial Killer. Her highly anticipated follow-up family saga, Cursed Daughters, hit shelves in November. Visit us online at clubbook.org for details on past and present seasons, sign up for our e-newsletter, check out our calendar, and so much more. Stay up to date with all of our events at our Club Book Facebook page. If you're on Twitter, find us using the handle ClubBookMN. And if you enjoy these free Club Book events and podcasts, remember to share them with your friends. They just may too. Thanks again to all those who make Club Book possible, including Melsa, Library Strategies, and Minnesota's Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. Our sponsors include Red Balloon Bookshop, where you can purchase all the books featured in Club Book. Finally, a very special thank you to all the libraries hosting events this season. That's it for Club Book, the coolest club in town. We'll see you at the library.